Steve Godson here, and I'm just going to say a few things about Finding Nemo and some broader things really about defining a film as Australian and really trying to make sense of what actually an Australian film is. Now, when it comes to understanding what an Australian film is, Australians have become very good at looking at Australian films as films that are produced from a production team within Australia and who are essentially Australian. So they look at films, Australian films made with an Australian production team, but also films outside of Australia now. Films like The Railway Man, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, where this is an international film, an internationally set film, but because it was made by essentially an Australian production team, it was funded by an Australian funding body, people are quite happy to accept that as an Australian film. But when it comes to people outside of Australia and non-Australians representing Australia, then often we all jump up and down and say, well, it might be representing Australia, but it's not an Australian film. And what I'm really wanting to do with Finding Nemo is to sort of reconsider that whole idea and actually think about ways that we can think about a film like Finding Nemo as Australian and what is it actually saying about Australia. And I think it's really important that it's not just Australians who are commenting and depicting Australia, but also non-Australians, because it's a good way of Australians understanding their place in the world. So I thought this was very revealing, and I just sort of came across this yesterday when I was doing something completely different. But it's the Val Morgan survey, and if you don't know what the Val Morgan survey is, it's basically a survey which they survey people on a number of different areas, a number of different things. And this one was about the Australian cinema and audience Australian cinema. And it says this in the final report. Many people also struggle to identify Australian content correctly, with some people naming films, television programs, or documentaries with only a tenuous relationship to Australia, such as having an Australian cast member rather than being an Australian production. Table 1 shows some examples of feature films, television programs that were incorrectly nominated as Australia. And some of the films on the list include Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, which is interesting because Romeo and Juliet was essentially made by an Australian production team, shot in Sydney. And also on the list is dear old Finding Nemo. Now, I have a problem with the Val Morgan findings, because essentially what they're saying is there's a correct way to understand a film as Australian and an incorrect way to understand a film as Australian. Almost like Australia has to have a sort of a tick sheet, and you have to tick particular things off the sheet, and once you've done that, then it's classified as Australian. And what it's really not taking into consideration is that clearly people are resonating with these films in an Australianness sort of way. And what I want to do is kind of work through that across this week, but also across weeks to come. I mean, The Matrix is really interesting, and a guy called Ben Goldsmith, who will be speaking a lot about over this course, he's actually written a paper on The Matrix, arguing that it is actually an Australian film because it's shot in Sydney, but there are many Sydney monuments and Sydney sort of known places that are being depicted in this film. And to not consider it as The Matrix is actually missing really what's going on in the visuals and the scenes and the sort of the scenic idea of really how that film's being worked out. So this is the problem I have, where it's, we sort of say, yes, Australia's part of the global world, but we're very narrow. We're still very narrow in what we're understanding and defining as an Australian film. And I think we've got to really challenge that. And as Ben Goldsmith really challenges that, I want us to really challenge that whole idea across this week, but also across the course more generally. So some questions to consider. What happens if we consider Finding Nemo an Australian film? Right? What actually happens if we think of Finding Nemo as an Australian film? And here's the real question. What resonance does this film have with an Australian audience? So what makes an Australian film? Well, Elizabeth Avram, whose paper is the recommended reading for this week. There's no required reading for this week, but there's recommended reading for this week, and it's Avram. And it's a really, really interesting piece, and I really strongly encourage you all to read it. It only goes for a few pages, so it's not long at all. But she says this: the notion of resonance of a particular text with an Australian audience. So if a film resonates with an Australian audience on an Australian level, then therefore she's saying, shouldn't we be considering that film as Australian to some sort of degree? And I really want to sort of put that out there. And rather than just dismiss that, let's actually consider it. And I think that's really important across this course. There will be a lot of papers and a lot of comments made which are sort of probes, they're provocations. And rather than just simply dismiss them, which is very easy to do, I want us to actually consider them. So rather than say, well, Finding Nemo is a Hollywood film set in Australia, therefore it's not an Australian film, let's actually start with a different approach and say, let's consider Finding Nemo Australia. Do we learn anything about Australia, the Australian cinema, Australian society, Australian culture, through considering that film as Australian? And it is really important that a film like Finding Nemo is actually being made by Americans. Like, why? What is it about that, the Great Barrier Reef in Sydney, that is having such a global resonance with people that they want to actually depict that in a Hollywood movie? That's very interesting in and of itself. Now, why Finding Nemo is different, and I think this is very important. You've got a number of films that have been made in Australia over sort of this period. You've got Mission Impossible 2, the John Woo film, Tom Cruise, and Scooby-Doo, the 2002 film, which I'm sure you've all seen. And then you've got Finding Nemo. But I would argue that Finding Nemo is a little different in what it's actually doing with Australia, with the Australian landscape, and with the Australian place more than space. With Mission Impossible 2, certainly, Australia is really just a space where the action takes place. It's almost a backdrop to the film, to the narrative. And you could actually take that anywhere and it would still actually be the same story. With Finding Nemo, it's doing something that profoundly engages with Australia as a place, the actual particular place and iconography and identity of Australia. And that's really important. That really does differ a film like Finding Nemo to, say, your Mission Impossible or your Matrix. And I really want us to think about that just when we're watching this film and really considering, what is an Australian film from an international perspective. Now, resonance with Australia. So if we're actually going to take Elizabeth's idea of if a film resonates with an Australian audience in an Australian kind of way, then therefore it should be considered part of the framework of what makes an Australian film. And I just sort of want to put these out there. Now, I'm not actually claiming that these films are Australian, but I'm just sort of saying that, well, maybe they kind of are Australian and they kind of are resonating with Australians in a particular way. Now, both of these films, Brokeback Mountain and Stoker, they did very well at the Australian box office. They did a lot better by percentage than a lot of other countries. I mean, Brokeback Mountain was a huge hit everywhere, but Stoker certainly wasn't. But it did actually do quite well in Australia. Now, Brokeback Mountain, why would I say that's an Australian film or has an Australian resonance? You got sheep and you got Heath Ledger. Do you need anything more for an Australian film or for a film to resonate with Australians? Clearly, Australians identify with Heath Ledger and sheep as an Australian film. And then you've got Stoker, which is a really fascinating film where you've got, the central leads. The central leads are all Australians. So although they're not playing Australians, they're playing Americans, when we're watching this film, what we're seeing on the screen are Australians. And we're making a lot of associations with those Australian actors and actresses through earlier Australian films that we've seen them in. And so again, a film like Stoker is sort of speaking in a very intimate and profound way to Australian audiences in ways that, say, an American audience or a British audience wouldn't be understanding. So just think about that. Of all these films that actually feature Australians, there is a resonance with Australian audiences. And I'm not saying they are therefore an Australian film. I'm just saying let's think about this whole idea of understanding the Australian cinema's place in the world. And really, is it limiting to sort of put a national framework around an Australian film? A lot of people are now saying that even an idea of a course on Australian cinema is a little limiting, that really Australian films should be part of a broader international course rather than a course specifically about Australia. Because to understand the Australian cinema, you have to understand it within the broader international context. Now, The Great Gatsby is really fascinating, and it's sort of a paradox because you've got all those people saying a film like Finding Nemo is not Australian for the following reasons. But then a lot of those people are standing up and saying, hey, Great Gatsby, fantastic. Isn't it great that this is an Australian film? But what I put out to you is why. It's an adaptation of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who, as far as I'm aware, was not Australian, was in fact very, very American. It stars Leo DiCaprio, who very, very, very American. It's the majority of its money came from America. It was actually going to be shot in America, but things changed and ended up being shot in Australia. What makes it Australian? Well, a lot of the small parts are actually played by Australians, and the director, of course, Baz Luhrmann and his production team are all predominantly Australians. But the film is not representing Australia in any profound way. And I would, make the argument, or actually just put out the question to you, then surely Finding Nemo is resonating with Australians in a particular Australian way than The Great Gatsby. Yet we're all quite happy to accept The Great Gatsby and embrace The Great Gatsby as an Australian film, but Finding Nemo still seems to rile people, and it really is quite a paradox. And that's what I want to talk about across, really across this week, but also across weeks to come. Then we have these other Australian films. Now, these are films that are being funded from Australian funding bodies. Their key crews and personnel are Australians. And we are quite happy to accept these films and embrace these films as Australian. The Railway Man and The Rocket have both been nominated for Australian Film Awards, and no one seemed to object to any of these films. And I'm certainly not objecting to them. I'm just sort of putting them out there and also sort of just mentioning a bit of a paradox or a bit of an irony that happens with certain people who are trying to sort of claim particular films as Australian and not other films as Australian. So The Rocket is, a really, really fascinating film. It's actually not even in the Australian language. It's set in Lao. It doesn't feature anything to do with Australians. I mean, at least The Railway Man had Dear Old Nicole. The Rocket has none of that, yet it is an Australian film, and it was nominated for, for a number of key Australian awards. This is a film that takes place outside of Australia. The Railway Man, this is a film that takes place outside of Australia. They're not Australian stories as far as on-screen Australian representation, and that's a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing that Australians now understand that Australian films aren't just about on-screen Australian representation, but at the same time, if Finding Nemo is actually representing Australia and trying to engage with Australia, therefore, even though it's a Hollywood production, we should be considering it also as part of this conversation, not just dismissing it. So, here is another quote from Elizabeth Avram. With the acceleration of globalisation, Australian audiences' experience of cinema as Australian has shifted beyond the textual into complex relationships between a film and its context in the entire milieu of filmmaking. But therefore, as I write, surely we need to rethink how we define an Australian film. Australian films must be considered both within and outside of Australia. And I think that's really important, right? That Australians can make Australian films, but outsiders can also make Australian films. It's not just this closed, inner sanctum kind of idea of a national cinema. And, to make a national cinema, you have to have, the director has to be Australian, the money has to come from Australia. All of that, I think, is really being questioned at the moment. And it's really important to keep questioning what an Australian film is, because it makes us think differently about Australian cinema, but it also makes us think importantly about what is Australia doing with international cinema. So the problem of only Australians making Australian films is everything becomes inward, not outward. And that's really bad. I mean, what we want is Australia to be part of the international, Australia to be part of the global. So therefore, our cinema has to also be, outward as much as we are outward. And it essentially limits how Australia is placed within the world by thinking of Australia too inwardly. And in my opinion, it sets up an ugly spiral. So if only Australians make Australian cinema, then can only Australians understand something as Australian? Can only Australians write on Australian films because they're Australian? Where does it actually stop? It's a real problem. And surely what we actually want is people all over the world talking and discussing Australian films, more than just this is just something that we do in Australia. So the point of this week, and of course in general, is to move from defining what an Australian film should be, right, to understanding what Australian cinema actually does. Like, what does it actually do? What is this film actually doing? So, Finding Nemo, if you actually think about what an Australian film should be, it's not an Australian film. But if you actually think about what an Australian film does, then Finding Nemo very nicely sits in that framework. What I want to do over all of the films that we're seeing in the course is to look at the films in the following ways, right? Their production, their reception, and their textuality. So their production, how was the film put together? Where does the money from the film come from? Who are the production crew? Who's the cast, actors, things like that. All of that that's around the production. The reception, how was the film received both inside and outside of Australia, right? And reception also tapped into things like distribution, exhibition. We've been talking a lot about distribution, exhibition across the following weeks. And textuality, what's actually happening on the screen? Is Australia being represented on the screen, and how is it being represented on the screen? The films that have been chosen in this course are all about on-screen Australian representation. So what I want to sort of put out there is how is Australia therefore being represented? So let's just apply that idea to Finding Nemo. To call this a purely Australian film is as problematic as calling it purely Hollywood, right? Like, you can't actually just say, well, it is an Australian film or it is a Hollywood film. It's actually a nice meeting point between the two. Now, what makes this film Australian, if we want to consider that? Well, think about this and think about what an Australian film is actually doing. So here you've got a film where all the research took place in Sydney and the Great Barrier Reef. This isn't an American film that you're just thinking of the Barrier Reef as a mythical place and that's what we're representing. They actually came here, they spent some time, and they put great detail into representing the Great Barrier Reef. The director watched a backlog of Australian films, you know, from all different sorts of films like Broken Morant to Gallipoli. He was watching Wake in Fright, which is a very peculiar film. If you actually have seen Wake in Fright, why he'd be choosing that film. The casting includes many prominent Australian actors: Eric Bana, Barry Humphries, Jeffrey Rush, Bill Hunter. I mean, the list does go on. The film features easily identifiable Australian landscapes, and that's really important. These landscapes you can actually go and visit. Now, you look at other films that we're seeing in the course, like, say, The Rover, you can't visit that place because it doesn't exist. It's been completely made up. Like Mad Max, the new Mad Max, again, you can't visit that Australia. That is a completely mythical Australia. But this Australia does exist and you can visit this Australia. Now, the film in Australia made $8 million in its opening Australian weekend. That's huge. That is huge business. So for an Australian film to make that sort of money is just absolutely incredible. So again, the reason why some people don't want to consider this as an Australian film is it goes against that constant argument that no one likes Australian films. Australians don't like Australian films, and no one wants to see Australian films. If you start to consider a film like this as Australian, right, then it completely throws that whole idea out of the window. Because clearly Australians do want to go and see Australian films. Finding Nemo, massive opening weekend. Mad Max, massive opening weekend. So what does that actually tell you? And both hugely positive reviews both in Australia and America this film received. Just one more quote to end with Elizabeth Avram. By analysing Finding Nemo from our side of the fence, we can gain some insight into how we see ourselves in the global community. Here. So this is not to dismiss the concept of national cinema, right? And I'm really interested in the whole idea of national cinema, but to rethink the wider ways that national cinema can be considered and globally understood. So when we think of national, it's not just within the borders of Australia. National is now a global idea and a global concept, and therefore Australians can make films outside of Australia, and also non-Australians can make films inside of Australia. Okay, that's my spiel for this week. I hope you enjoy Finding Nemo. I think it's a really fascinating film, and I reckon it's going to be a film that we're going to keep returning to across the course. Okay, see you in the screening. Looking forward to it.